Donald Trump wins another key contest in his quest to secure the U.S. Republican presidential nomination. His rival is not backing down yet. Can Nikki Haley turn it around? Hello, I'm Arland Naidu, and this is The Heat. New Hampshire saw record voter turnout in its primary election Tuesday night. Donald Trump beat his opponent, former South Carolina Republican Governor Nikki Haley, by more than 11 percentage points. CGTN's Rina Mitchell has this report.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Whoa!
A significant win for Donald Trump in his quest for a second non-consecutive term in the White House, handily defeating Republican rival Nikki Haley in New Hampshire's GOP presidential primary. But coming out swinging after the former South Carolina governor and United Nations ambassador conceded the state but refused to quit.
New Hampshire is first in the nation. It is not the last in the nation. This race is far from over.
Just a little note to Nikki. She's not going to win.
The former president's double-digit victory adds to his delegate count after an historic first-place finish in Iowa and puts him on track to secure a third consecutive Republican presidential nomination, despite facing 91 felony charges. On the Democratic side, incumbent Joe Biden easily defeated closest rival Dean Phillips, doing so as a write-in candidate. His name didn't appear on the New Hampshire ballot due to a dispute over the date of the state's primary. As a result, no delegates were awarded. On the campaign trail in Virginia, the incumbent spared no time going after Trump.
I'm betting come November, we will vote in record numbers. And when we do that, we'll teach Donald Trump a valuable lesson.
Voters we spoke with after casting their ballots were decisive about who they wanted and didn't want to win.
Nikki Haley.
Why?
Because I think she's the only alternative, and I think she's the best candidate, and I think the country needs a change.
Dean Phillips. If Joe Biden didn't register to be on the ballot in New Hampshire, I'm not writing him in, okay? He's totally written off New Hampshire in my mind. He never came and visited once.
President Trump will be the 47th president of the United States.
Both Biden and Trump, along with the rest of the field, now turn their attention to South Carolina, Nevada, and Michigan next month, as a possible rematch between the two in a general election now appears more likely. Rina Mitchell, CGTN, New Hampshire.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Rina Shah is a political strategist, commentator, and founder and CEO of Rilax Strategies. Jacquie Luqman is coordinator of the Black Alliance for Peace D.C. Rafael Bernal is a staff writer at The Hill. And joining us from Miami, Jadan Horyn is a political and cultural commentator. Welcome to all of you. Jadan, let me start with you. Let's see what the situation looks like almost 24 hours after it was announced that President Trump had won, former President Trump had won that primary in New Hampshire. He won pretty convincingly, as we just heard. He got 55% of the vote, Nikki Haley with just over 43%, and Haley, as we also heard, saying that she's not withdrawing from the race. But given the margin of Trump's win in New Hampshire and also his win in Iowa, has he got something of a lock on the nomination right now?
Well, I believe that the voters don't want a coronation, but I would say that the momentum belongs to the former president, and it should. You know, he has never lost the excitement of his base, and it is quite clear that opposite to what pundits had thought, he managed to expand the ceiling that he previously was back in 2016. I think we all remember he was around the 33% ceiling.
Jadan, we can't hear you. I'm going to move on. We'll try to get back to you, Jadan. Rina, I want to look at some of the breakdown on who voted for Trump. But first, Does Nikki Haley still have a path to the nomination?
There is a path that is not impossible, but it is riddled with landmines. And I would say this next month will be really crucial, obviously, because she's getting to her native South Carolina on February 24th. And of course, being a former governor of that state, she doesn't want an embarrassment. But all people can talk about right now is how the polling is not looking so great out of South Carolina. Last night in her speech there in New Hampshire, she said she's been used to going up against the political establishment. And that sort of alluded to the fact that Senator Tim Scott, the sitting senator who she appointed, I must add, back in 2012 to the U.S. Senate, as well as her own Congresswoman, Nancy Mace, who's sitting in the House right now, they have endorsed Trump. But I say this, those two individuals in particular, I think are looking for a VP nod. And they feel that coming out right now and endorsing Trump, who seems to have better chances, obviously, after Iowa and now again after New Hampshire, they feel that they're doing the right thing. But moving onward, after South Carolina gets super tricky for her, it's Super Tuesday, which is the tell-all be-all. And I think the tell-all is essentially that we will have a lot of winner-takes-all contests. And if she cannot pick up those delegates, then the path to the nomination is almost impossible.
Okay, Rina, let's look at who voted for Trump on Tuesday. He won across all groups, if you look at the numbers.
Right.
Age, gender, race. The Washington Post cited exit polls which showed 59% of men voted for Trump compared to 40% for Haley. For women, 50% of women chose Trump, while 48% voted for Haley. When you look at those numbers, what do you read into them?
Well, I also look at the fact that New Hampshire has a great rural population. And let's talk about rural America, because I actually grew up in a rural state, West Virginia, that's much like New Hampshire. And I spent a whole summer living in Manchester, New Hampshire, and it's just lovely. The people are good. They're very salt-of-the-earth folks, New Hampshire folks. And I must say, they really are, you know, they're plugged up and plugged in, obviously, when it comes to this first-in-the-nation primary. They are proud of that. It's a great source of pride. But looking beyond that, rural populations are lower educated, of course. They are people who suffer greater economic woes. And I think what you saw in a lot of the people was nostalgia for what the world, our society, American society, felt like under Trump. It felt like the cost of living was not so crushing. You're looking at the price of daily commodities that haven't come down as much as we'd hoped. And then also the geopolitical tensions around the world that we seem to be porting money to. And it's a situation in which you do get that sentiment that we saw in MAGA take hold so greatly, that why is America not first right now? Why are we not investing here at home? So every time Donald Trump says it, it resonates with these folks, whether male or female.
So Trump's got a better message than Biden?
In many ways, yes, because sure, it's a message of grievance and revenge on its face, but it's one that attacks the White House right now. And despite touting good numbers, the Biden administration does suffer from the feel that people are handcuffed to mortgages right now. And though there are more jobs available, can they really even move forward and move up the economic ladder like the previous generation did?
Jacquie Luqman, Trump also finished ahead of Nikki Haley, among non-white voters. Again, the Washington Post reported that 54% of white voters voted for Trump and 44% for Haley. For non-white voters, 59% voted for Trump compared to 38% for Haley. What do you make of those numbers?
Well, first of all, non-white voters is a broad category that I guess includes everybody who is not a European descendant. So that's a kind of a dubious kind of category to just lump everybody in and then create this narrative that, look, people of color like Trump too. When you break that category down into different groups of people, you're not going to find that kind of support among a largely a Black, Latinx, and probably not a lot of Asian voters who are not so-called middle class, whatever the middle class is supposed to be in this country anymore, because the poor and the working poor, working class poor and oppressed people in this country have a different understanding about the economy, whether it's under Trump or whether it's under Biden. Poor people have been suffering in this country for a long time. They've been suffering under unlivable wages, under rents and interest rates that are astronomical, so they can't afford to buy a home if they want to. Student loan debt is crushing, and it's something that affects mostly students of color who come from lower socioeconomic groups. So this idea that generally people of color voted in the primaries at around 50-something% to support in support of Trump over Haley, I need to know who they're talking about. That category needs to not be so broad to make it seem like Trump has made these inroads into communities that he hasn't done anything for when he was president, and that certainly Biden hasn't done anything for since he's been president either.
Yeah, I get your point about this being a very broad category, calling people non-white, but that's the terminology that was used by the Washington Post. There wasn't a further breakdown on non-white people who voted for Trump. But you'd mentioned Biden at the end there. How big an issue is this for Biden? Because there is a belief, and we've seen this from results in previous elections, that people who are not white tend to vote for Democrats.
There is some history to that, but the history is also very back and forth. For Black voters, when Black people were finally, when we finally won the right to vote, we were largely Republican voters because the Republican Party was then supposedly the anti-slavery party. Of course, with the Richard Nixon campaign and the switch, the exodus from the Republican Party of people who were opposed to any kinds of civil rights legislation, that ushered in this new, very, very overtly right-wing and white supremacist Republican Party that was no longer interested in human rights for everyone. Then you had a shift in particularly Black voters supporting the Republican Party, and then they moved over to supporting the Democratic Party, especially around 1964, I think, the 1964 Democratic Convention, where the issue of civil rights was on the platform. And since then, because of the continued economic and social struggles that Black voters in particular, indigenous voters, Latinx voters, immigrant voters, and now we have to say certainly Muslim voters have continued to suffer in this country, because politicians only talk to us when it's election time. Outside of election time, they don't care what we want, they don't care what we need, and they just don't think of us. So that is a history that we need to keep in mind, that Black voters in particular, yes, they will vote for quote unquote harm reduction because they don't want to see another Trump presidency, because, you know, they think Trump is the worst thing to happen since, I don't know, slavery, I guess. But the fact is, the Democratic Party has not met the needs of working class and poor voters of color across the board. And people are realizing that. So no, this does not bode well for the Democratic Party either.
Rafael, Bernal, what did you make of the results? Were there any surprises in there, or did it go pretty much according to what the polls have been telling us?
Pretty much according to what the polls have been telling us. I think one important distinction was that New Hampshire independents voting in the Republican primary. Remember, in New Hampshire, people who registered independent, they had to register last October. They had to pick a party or stay independent, but those who register independent can vote for either party. Nikki Haley did fairly well with that group, which I think the Biden campaign can take as not as excellent news, but as the idea that some independent voters are still never Trumpers or looking for options other than Trump, which is where they will be campaigning, and people who registered Republican just overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Haley's result is not the worst she could have had, but it's also not great. And the fact that she's gearing up for a home state loss is keeping a lot of people wondering why she stayed in this. But I mean, she is the most effective traditional politician who's been competing for the Republican nomination. So I wouldn't discount her having a strategy, and really a long-term strategy. She still has a political career ahead of her, And Trump, even if he wins, his political career is over 5 years from now. Essentially, his elected political career, unless something huge changes in the Constitution, which unlikely, very unlikely. So yeah, I didn't see many surprises. I was surprised about this non-white voter statistic, just because New Hampshire isn't the most diverse state in the country.
Right.
That's really an understatement, and you don't really have a very big field of people. It's not a representative group. People who New Hampshire, non-white New Hampshire residents who voted in the Republican primary, it's just not representative.
I think it was about 8% actually of the entire voting population, the Republican side. Jadan, you know, as we heard, Nikki Haley is staying in the race, and she's been talking to her supporters, trying to explain why she hasn't done as well as expected. She blames the Republican political elite, whom she says continues to back Trump. Let's listen to her.
I think it's not the party uniting around President Trump, it's the political elite that are uniting around President Trump. And the political elite have never been with me my entire career, because I've always fought the political elite. It's why I want them to have term limits. It's why I want them to have mental competency tests.
So, Jadan, what do you make of her argument? I mean, is the fact that she finished second in this race in New Hampshire, I mean, due to a lack of support from the party's top brass, or is it the fact that voters just don't find her to be a viable alternative to Donald Trump?
Look, I think this is almost comical, because the Republican political donor class and the Democratic political donor class, they are grooming substitutes and backups. We have Gavin Newsom on the Democratic side, and we have the donor class that is clearly telling Nikki Haley to stay in this race, because what we do know is that 35% of New Hampshire voters said they would not vote, Republican voters said they would not vote for Donald Trump. Another, almost 40% of voters have said that if Donald Trump faced a conviction, then that would change their calculus. So I personally believe that it is really, truly the Republican donor class that is actually telling her to stay in. So it's really ironic. You know, yes, she has been an anti-elitist. I mean, obviously, she was a minority Indian American woman running in a southern white state, South Carolina, and won governorship, made, you know, first woman, obviously first Indian American in that state. Yes, okay. However, in this case, she is the choice of the donor class, much as Gavin Newsom is on the Democratic side. She is the backup. She is the insurance policy if there is a conviction that really, truly tanks Trump with voters. A viable choice. So why do I think she's staying in? She's staying in to show that she can keep momentum, that she can take the hard knocks, that she could lose massively in her own state, and get the loyalty of the Republican voters and the base, not alienate the Trump supporters too much, not piss off the president too much. And if there's a conviction, then she can be brought in. That's why she's in. So I understand what she's saying, but talking points are different than reality in this case.
Rina, what do you make of that?
I actually don't disagree with much of that, because people say, well, she's sticking in the race for her own personal ambition. Of course. Why shouldn't she? I think it's incredible when I see American women have ambition, and I've seen a lot on the left. And to see a conservative woman like her coming as the daughter of immigrants from a rural state and having this American experience and saying, I'm still right of center, and having women who are left of center turn their heads and say, you know what, she just might be somebody that's palatable. She might be somebody that I actually like.
But is she plan B?
You know, maybe in the back of her mind after last night, of course it's there. But what I do agree with, it's the money in the coffers that keeps things going. You know, we have the major decision of Citizens United here, and that changes everything. So the money, the desire, the stamina to see this thing out, and stick around to see whether Trump is convicted, and maybe a couple trials that happen before the July convention. He could be a convicted felon. And that complicates things on the floor of the Republican convention come July. The party will have a tough decision to make. There's an entryway for her. There's an entryway for DeSantis. Heck, there's even an entryway for Vivek Ramaswamy, perhaps even. At that point, the party has to decide. And let's not forget, there's the Supreme Court as well that's going to be looking at the Colorado ballot decision by their Supreme Court. And Maine, the Secretary of State who made the decision to keep Trump off the ballot there is saying we will look at to see what the Supreme Court decides with Colorado. So it is all many layers of complication here. But one thing is for sure, this is a qualified, credible American woman. And I have not endorsed her. I have reservations about her. I've not endorsed anybody in the primary. And I'm not sure who I would vote for in the general, frankly. But I do see MAGA's concerns, the MAGA faction of the Republican Party that is dwindling in size, I must add, because the last midterms gave us that empirical evidence. They are not, they don't hold the power anymore. But they call Nikki a forever wars type of Republican. They call her a corporate bought and paid for shill. And that is the concern they have about her. But look at her on her face. She talks about kitchen table issues responsibly, and she also talks about abortion very practically and reasonably.
Okay, you mentioned abortion. Jacquie, earlier this week, Biden and Deputy President Kamala Harris started campaigning on what they are calling, quote, the Fight for Reproductive Freedoms Tour. We do know, of course, that the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade 2 years ago. It's now very much up to individual states on the question of abortion. But how big an issue is this going to be in the run-up to November?
I'm not sure how big an issue it can be when the Democratic Party had not done anything to codify reproductive rights, to protect reproductive rights in 2 presidential terms before now. Barack Obama had an opportunity to do it, to codify Roe versus Wade, and he said at the time that abortion wasn't a priority. It went during his 2 terms in the White House. Joe Biden didn't do much more, and we see what has happened because of that, and because the Biden administration was already going into this crisis in Palestine. Just a long track record of broken promises and disappointments from what his administration did not do. Didn't protect SNAP benefits that were cut, didn't protect CHIP insurance for the children of working class and poor families, didn't protect, we still don't have student loan debt relief. So people are really wondering, didn't protect the environment from additional drilling, all things that he said he would do, protect women and, our bodily autonomy rights, hasn't done any of this. So I'm not sure how he is going to make his campaign about protecting reproductive rights that his administration did not do. And more people, I know there is a lot of visual excitement around Biden's campaigns with the people with the signs and all this kind of thing, but again, regular folks, working class and poor folks, they understand that the Biden administration has done not much more to protect them than any Republican administration would have done to attack them. So the Biden administration, I don't think, is going to make a whole lot of inroads making this a campaign issue for his reelection.
Rina, very quickly, briefly if you can, this issue of abortion, many Republicans have backed that Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. That was not a popular decision with voters both liberal and conservative. Could it cost Republicans votes?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the hardliners on abortion, the ones who show up at the March for Life rally annually here in D.C., they wanted abortion tossed back to the states. This was always the argument. And so what you hear is a lot of these folks are coast to coast saying, let's go mum on it, because they know that every time it comes up, it feels as if, to especially the younger college-educated suburban woman, that the Republican Party is taking away their rights. Bodily autonomy, freedom. Right.
Rafael, Bernal, you wrote a piece in The Hill on immigration. In fact, you cited a poll that was a Harvest Caps Harris poll in which you say that immigration has passed inflation as the top concern for voters. And so far as voters' concerns are, that scored 35%, inflation at 32%. We know that the Republicans have portrayed Biden and his administration as the administration that has opened the gates on the southern border and allowed anyone to enter the country. So looking at this poll and how important immigration is for voters, is that bad news for Biden?
It is. It is bad news for Biden because because he hasn't opened up the gates. Nobody has opened up the gates. If immigration fell precipitously at some point during the Trump administration, the biggest factor was COVID. It wasn't Trump policies. So that means Biden can't really change much. They can have the appearance of changing things. Let's remember the other factor is inflation has, mind the language has sort of deflated as an attack against Biden. As numbers have objectively gone down or inflation has stabilized, there's still a lot of talk of prices are still high, but yeah, I don't think the Fed is looking for actual deflation. That's probably economically worse. But in any case, inflation is just not the attack line that it was last year. Bidenflation is not going to cut it for Republicans. So the next best thing is the border, and they can attack him on the border because it is I don't know if it's a crisis or not a crisis, like it really, the beauty's in the eye of the beholder kind of thing, but it is a chaotic situation that is very difficult to manage, and the Biden administration is having trouble managing.
Yeah. Jadan, I've just got about a minute left, under a minute in fact. There are now some Republican commentators are already saying, even at this stage, they're urging Trump to pivot away from the primaries right now and go straight into campaigning for the general election. And there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal today which said that, yes, great win for Trump, but he now has to attract those independents if he hopes to see any kind of success in November. How difficult is that going to be?
Well, I don't really actually think it's going to be that difficult. What we do know is that based on current nationwide polling, the Real Clear averages have Trump about 3.8% above Biden. In every single swing state except for Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, President Trump is ahead of Joe Biden. And that's based on registered and likely voters, a mix of both of those type of polling. So what we do know is that there already is a general election race that is occurring in most people's mind. It is versus Biden, and the president, the former president, really does truly have a leg up.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.